As the search progressed, we of course had debris come ashore, and that gave us, firstly it told us we're searching the right ocean, and there was speculation that the aircraft might have wound up in Kazakhstan, for goodness sake, and so we saw the flaperon come ashore on La Réunion Island in July 2015. We saw Blaine Gibson's efforts lead to the discovery of many pieces of debris around the shores of Africa, and critically we found a piece of flap also in Tanzania, which was also key for us because we could actually analyse that piece of debris and attempt to ascertain whether the flaps were either deployed, which meant that there was likely to be a controlled ditching at the end of flight, or indeed they weren't deployed. So our failure analysts took that section of flap and analysed it, and what they found, of course, was that it was not deployed when it separated from the aircraft. This, for us, was very important because up to that time, while we considered every possible scenario, we had, for the first time, something that, if you like, eliminated the potential for the actual aircraft to be controlled by an individual and be in a state where it was being controlled ditched, or likely to be. Not long after that, the Defence Science and Technology Group looked at that last transmission from the aircraft, which was a bit different because it was unscheduled. It occurred about 8 minutes after the previous one. It was in a place where the aircraft could most feasibly have exhausted its fuel. It was also unusual because it was the aircraft satellite data unit logging back on after a period of power outage, and it was also incomplete, if you like. Most of the transmissions that you see are a series. They're not a single transmission from the aircraft to the ground earth station and back. It's actually 10s or 20 different signals that occur at different times to actually set up different components, if you like, in the communication system. And this one, particularly when an aircraft's logging on to the SATCOM network, it has a whole series of things that occur. In this case, it was only a log-on request and a log-on acknowledged, just two. So in that sense, it was incomplete. This is what we had at first, and it told us that it was likely that that transmission was triggered by fuel exhaustion, and there's no earthly reason why someone in control of an aircraft would exhaust its fuel and then attempt to glide it when they have the option of controlled ditching. So in a sense, it showed to us at first that the most likely scenario, not to the exclusion of every other, but the most likely scenario at that point was the aircraft was probably descending in an uncontrolled manner.
In terms of making a determination about where you search, given the potential vast area, is because the different methods of whether it was controlled or not would widen the search so far that you basically just have to limit it as much as you can?
I think what our strategy at first was to look where along the arc based on those two key pieces of information we had, that's the burst timing offset and the burst frequency offset, where it was most likely the aircraft crossed the arc, and that drew us down to fairly southern latitudes between about 32 and 40 or 39 south latitude. And then, of course, we had to simulate the end of flight. We didn't, and we still don't understand perfectly what happened at the end of flight. Boeing ran a number of simulations for us, and indeed, some of the outcomes of those simulations were a behaviour which was fairly stable. So we knew that the right engine, for example, consumed more fuel. It was likely to have flamed out first and up to 15 minutes before the left engine. The thrust asymmetry compensation on the aircraft actually, the autopilot compensates for that. There's no need for anyone in the cockpit to do anything at that stage. So the thrust asymmetry compensation puts a little bit of rudder on, and the aircraft continues to fly a straight path on a single engine. However, when that second engine flames out, you get a situation where the autopilot drops out, thrust asymmetry compensation also it ceases to function, if you like, and what happens is a little bit of residual rudder stays on and it establishes, in this case, a left-hand spiralling turn. The Boeing simulations also showed the behaviour of the aircraft was pretty stable. It was likely to be in what we call a phugoid motion, and this is where the aircraft actually pitches over, picks up speed, and then picks up lift, and then starts to climb a little on the way down. The analysis that was latterly done by the Defence Science and Technology Group on the last couple of communications to try and ascertain, or bound, if you like, the rates of descent, showed us that the aircraft was also in a high and increasing rate of descent at some point in the context of that phugoid. So there again, this was evidence that we didn't have someone who was actively trying to glide it to a maximum range. It was much more likely that the aircraft was uncontrolled. The totality of all the evidence we looked at when it became available, and understand too that analysis was continuous right throughout, from the time that we started the search right to the time that we ended the search and beyond. We were still analysing various information to try and narrow down that search area. We also had different times when the debris, for example, coming inshore gave us some key evidence that we used for other things like modelling the drift of the debris. We commissioned the CSIRO to do on our behalf. So I can say with great confidence, Senator, that we considered every piece of evidence that we had at the time in an unbiased fashion, and what we're seeing in the press is perhaps a lot of speculation about a single piece of evidence.
So the recent media speculation has centred on disputing whether there was someone in charge of the flight at the end. You're confident that the overwhelming evidence is that there was no one in charge of the airplane by the time it entered the ocean?
Senator, what we've said continually in our reports, and if you read them carefully, as you've got, there's lots of pages, but what we've said is the flaps in a non-deployed state means that a controlled ditching is unlikely. Not impossible, unlikely, because at some point they may have separated. However, we've also said that the high and increasing rate of descent makes the intent of anyone in the cockpit to extend the aircraft to its maximum range also unlikely, but we haven't ever ruled out someone intervening at the end. It's unlikely.
In terms of, and obviously we'd never hope we get another instance where we are investigating a similar occasion, but with the benefit of hindsight, would you conduct the investigation in a different way if you were to be looking at something similar?
You have to understand that we didn't have certain key piece of evidence available to us. It wasn't all available right up front. We did the best analysis that we could, and we also were working in parallel with the investigation process. You know, the actual cause of this is being investigated primarily by the Annex 13 team in Malaysia and also the Royal Malaysian Police. So our role was very, very clearly to find that aircraft and to access and analyse the data that would help in doing so, and we did.
Thanks, Chair.
Just before I go to you, Senator Patrick, I'm very familiar with, I've spent 20 years investigating catastrophic accidents in international flights from a factual point of view, not, I still don't know how an aircraft stays up in the air. I'm fascinated by it, but of all the rumours and innuendos through the media and some insurance pressures and so on. So reports such as that the pilot had overrode general instructions and ordered a different fuel quantity, that's nonsense?
Sorry, I'll verbalise that. We know at top of climb precisely how much fuel the aircraft had on board because we had an ACARS message which included that. So we know absolutely that the aircraft had what it should have had for a trip to Beijing on board.
Yeah. And no evidence that there'd been any alterations made. I don't imagine, is it a circumstance where a pilot could?
My understanding is the pilot orders the fuel, and if he wants
but
a
consistent
little
with
more.
calculated fuels, that volumes that...
It appears so. That's never been questioned by the investigation. As I said, that's the investigation. I mean, we knew precisely how much fuel was on board, which to give us a maximum range and therefore indicate somewhere to look. And that was our primary concern with fuel information.
Interesting. Very thorough report, Mr. Farley. We appreciate it. Senator Patrick.